All right, hey everybody, we're going to talk about the rise of unions. And we've already seen union activity in the past with the Gilded Age and the rise of factories, but now it's going to get more accepted, I guess, than the earlier days with the Knights of Labor. So it says, what major union will form today that unites all workers in an industry? They may be skilled and unskilled, all in the same building. In what ways was the federal government now a safety net for the Americans? And on the other hand, what ways was the government seen as maybe too powerful? Okay, so we have the rise of unions. So we know we've already talked about the Wagner Act. When I had the wagon and the people getting on board, is going to say we're going to protect workers. So if you're on the wagon, if you're in a union, you'll be protected in certain ways, like better pay or you can't get fired, that kind of thing. It says these unions also use binding arbitration and sit-down strikes to get what they want. Okay, sit-down strikes. So I've got my little Lego men here, and you notice they're all sitting on the job. Okay, sitting. I lost one. Sitting on the job. And even, I'll put Chewbacca up here now. Here's Chewbacca. He's going to sit on the job. Notice that they all have weapons. Now, what you would do is you would sit literally on the machine. So this would prevent a scab, okay, which would be a strike breaker, from walking in and taking over and doing your job because you're sitting on the machine. So he's just kind of stuck. He can't do anything with the machine because you're literally sitting on it. Like this thing would be the machine, and he can't do the job because they were sitting on the machine. Now, back to them having weapons there. I mean, this would often cause all kinds of violence. Let me show you some pictures, actual pictures. This is Flint plant where, see the cars in the background, and the guys are literally sitting. So they were taking seats out of cars and sitting there. This guy's even in the trunk, okay? And basically in the way of the assembly line so nothing can get done. Here is a good example of how it says 100% union, 46 days going strong. It's talking about they're on strike. Okay, so literally they'd be inside and outside of the building so that the scabs could not come through, or strike breakers. Okay, John Lewis is going to form the CIO in 1935, and they are going to organize all workers in an industry, both skilled and unskilled. Okay, so now it's called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It still is in existence. I'll prove that in a second. But what's interesting is they unite all workers. So it'd be like, if it's not, but if it was our school, Chattanooga Central, it would be like it would unite both me, the teacher, with the janitors, the custodial staff, with the secretaries. We would all be in this union. Didn't matter if some of us had college degrees and some of us didn't, because we're all in it together. We work at the same place. So that's the CIO. They will later join with, what you already know, the AFL. American Federation of Labor joins with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and they become the AFL-CIO. Okay, so it's going to bring a lot of folks, a lot of unions together, and a lot of folks in the union. It says their first focus was automobile and steel industries because that's where the biggest problems were between workers and the boss. And then I showed you the Flint, Michigan picture. One got so bad, a sit-down strike, where police launched tear gas on the workers. Okay, so you can think of, I was showing you the weapons while ago with my Lego men. Literally, the police are going to use weaponry against these sit-down strikers. In 1938, after pressure from the unions, Congress finally passes fair labor standards. And it says you get 40 cents an hour minimum wage. So don't look at the 40 cents so much. It establishes a minimum wage, which we have today, a minimum wage. It establishes a minimum work week of 40 hours. Okay, and a maximum work week. So if you are blue collar, you only work 40 hours. Okay, you're not going to work overtime. Child labor restrictions to those under 16. So we finally solidified that. And this is more like what you know. This is getting us more recent. Even though it's 1938, we still use the 40-hour work week, and we still use child labor restrictions to those under 16. Okay, next thing is the end of the New Deal. So by August of 37, the nation had entered a recession. That means it's better than a depression. But obviously the New Deal was no miracle cure. So it says the recession, the reason why we can't rise out of the recession is because of the Social Security tax. People have less money because money, now that they're working, if they got a job during the New Deal program, like a CCC worker, they're getting paid, but some of that money goes back into the Social Security tax that they're automatically getting drafted out of their check. So it says they're going to spend less if they're getting paid less. The economy continues to kind of go downhill. FDR is worried about the rising national debt and how we're going to fund the New Deal. We're having to borrow a lot of money just to fund our New Deal programs. And then it says Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau is going to say, hey, let's balance the budget, balance it, instead of it being like this, okay, where we've got all these programs, but we don't have any money to pay for them. Why don't we balance it where we cut our spending? So if we cut spending, spending goes to here, less spending, which means we now can have more money to pay for our programs. That was Morgenthau. Others thought Keynesian economics should be used, that basically the government, even though you're in a recession, the government should spend even more, because once the government spends a lot more, people have more money, and then they're going to spend that money, so everything kind of evens out. FDR says, let's just do that. Let's just spend more heavily to jumpstart the economy. That's a very, very Democrat thing to do. Spend more to make more. Okay? And I can talk to you more about that in class later if you're confused. I want to show you the recession. What happens in a recession, better than a depression, but still bad, is that GNP goes down, so the amount of products we're producing is just not high. And because businesses are just not churning out things, they have to lay people off, so unemployment increases. Well, why do businesses decline? Because people are not spending their money. And this goes back to these two issues. But FDR is going to pick Keynesian economics. I want to show you one more thing. See, this shows the recession, nosedive. Well, see, we were down here in the through the floor here in a depression. So at least we've climbed up to here. But I'm saying we're working backwards. We want to be up here at the peak, okay, where things are really, really good. Okay, so then we've got the legacy of the New Deal. So the federal government has basically taken on a broker state role. That's on the test. Make sure you know it's where government works out conflict between businesses, like workers and the boss, such as the collective bargaining, farmers and the railroad industry, a broker state. So they're going to kind of broker out the arguments, talk to everyone, manage that, kind of like conflict resolution to try to get the conflicts down. But it says the federal government is also seen as a safety net for Americans with safeguards to protect against economic disaster. Because now we have the New Deal programs, we have brought in the FDIC that insures people's money in the banks. So we have some safety nets to make sure that such a horrible depression will not happen again. But it says critics argue the New Deal made government too big. This would be more the Republican philosophy that the government's in everything now. You know, they're regulating every banks, they're regulating farmers, they're regulating railroads, they're regulating everything. Businesses, you know, the Flint, Michigan plant, they're involved in everything. And that might be too much. Okay? All right, so then the last thing is we have this explosion of books and films because of the Depression. Once we climb out of that, some of that reflects the time period. Zora Neale Hurston is African American. She's going to write Their Eyes Were Watching God. You also have The Grapes of Wrath that you are actually going to read a small portion of in class by John Steinbeck. This is probably one of my favorite books that I read in English and in history classes in college. It's a story about the Judd family that tries to get out of Arkansas and into, I'll show you here, Oklahoma and into California. So you see this movement from Oklahoma Remember that we had the Sooners that came in here and earlier in our class. Now all these people are leaving because the Dust Bowl and the Depression have hit, and they're looking on US 66 for a route into California because they've heard there's fruit there, migrant jobs to pick fruit. They're desperate to get out of Oklahoma. They're called Okies because they leave Oklahoma. Okay, here is another. I'm not sure if this one will work. No, it's not going to work. It was a picture of Henry Fonda in that movie. But anyway, Grapes of Wrath is a movie. Soap operas, because now soap companies sponsor radio commercials, like Dove soap or Zest and all these different soap companies. So what they do is all the commercials during the radio broadcast of these shows, like every 5 minutes they have commercials. All the commercials were soap commercials. So they started getting the nickname soap operas. Later, when we get into the 60s, those start being put on television. Right now, we're still just on the radio. Films, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington has Jimmy Stewart. I do have a picture of that. I think it's going to work. And this is where there's this huge filibuster in the Senate, and he's just average Joe that got elected. And he's trying to do the right thing by the American people, and he's mired in all this paperwork and mess that goes on in Washington. So that's a famous movie that comes out during this time. And then Wizard of Oz is put on the big screen. If you remember, I taught you when we did the Wizard of Oz with populism, we talked about that they changed Dorothy's shoes from silver, which is how it should have been, because the farmers wanted the silver, to ruby red slippers because it looked better, because now they have Technicolor, so film is actually going to be in color, not black and white anymore. Snow White and Seven Dwarfs is put out there by Walt Disney, who drew that cartoon. It becomes a movie. I have a picture of that here. So he's going to animate Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and that comes out during this time period. Okay, it's got here 1938. Gone with the Wind is another one that's very famous about the Civil War, and Scarlett O'Hara struggles after the Civil War, and that's also produced during this time. You also have the Federal Writers Project, which gets over 6,000 writers to write oral histories about the Civil War, interviewing people that survived the Civil War, about the Depression that they just went through. And you also have the Federal Arts Project, which continues the idea of the WPA, painting murals on buildings, sculptures, all kinds of artwork that will be in the community. And they're getting paid to do this. So this further supports getting people jobs. Okay? All right, so you need to write a summary. Make sure you do that. And I'm going to go back to the essential questions. So what major union formed today that unites everyone, skill and unskilled, in one building? And that was called the CIO, which we now call Congress for Industrial Organizations, led by John L. Lewis. Okay, in what ways was the federal government now a safety net for Americans? So that was on the next page, and the other one was, how is it seen too powerful? So down here, safety net. Well, we said the government taking on this broker state role is working out conflicts, and now they have like a safety net to protect us against disaster, such as setting up the FDIC, for example. So there's insurance in banks, and the bank won't just take your money. But some critics say, whoa, this has made the government too powerful. They're involved in banks now, the railroad business, other businesses like automobile. They're telling everyone what to do. And many argue that they should not intervene in the economy or even helping the poor. Some holdouts are still saying Hoover was right. Okay, so you need to go back and answer or write, your summary. Remember, 3 sentences at least. Okay, and that'll do it. Thanks, guys.